Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay, the faculty podcast of New College of Florida. My name is Douglas Estes, and I'm the Associate Professor of Religion here at New College.
And my name's Bruce Gilley. I'm Presidential Scholar in Residence here at the New College, and we're thrilled to have with us this session Dr. Casey Wheatland, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science here at the New College. And welcome to the show, Casey.
Bruce, thank you. Douglas, thank you for having me on. This is a great pleasure.
We usually start with a little bit of kind of bio-epic. Tell us a little about yourself, how your journey into academia got started, how you ended up here at the New College.
Absolutely. Well, I grew up in Ottawa, Illinois. I actually grew up north of there on a little farm, and so in the rural north central part of the state. And I was a weird kid in that I devoured history books as a child. And other young boys, they want to grow up and they want to be a policeman or a fireman or a dinosaur. By the time I was 12, I realized I wanted to be a historian. And specifically, I wanted to be a military historian. I wanted to be the next Victor Davis Hanson. I loved his books, and I still do. And as I was growing up, I didn't have much experience with academia. Neither of my parents have a 4-year degree. Most of my immediate family did not go to college. And so I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was told at some point that if you want to study history in the Midwest, you should go to the University of Wisconsin. And so that's what I did. And over the course of my time there, I realized that I did not really want to be a historian, once I realized what historians do in their daily life. And so my interest began to shift. And so first it shifted from military history to intellectual history. And while I was studying, I took many courses in literature and philosophy, I realized intellectual history isn't really what I wanted to do either, although it was getting close to what I wanted. It eventually shifted into political theory and political science. And so by the time that I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, I knew I wanted to go to grad school. I knew I wanted to do something in political science. But I still did not feel like I was totally knew what I wanted to do or what I should do. One day I was in the library, I was reading a book by a man named Paul Ray. And it was a wonderful book, and I thought to myself, well, where does he teach? Do they have a grad program? And I looked at the back of the book, he taught at Hillsdale College. And so I went to the Hillsdale College website, and they listed a core curriculum they have for the study of American politics and political philosophy. And I realized, well, this is what I need. Because I know these are the things I want to study, but I don't feel yet that I am shaped in these things, that I have studied all the classics that I need in order to understand these things competently. And so I applied to Hillsdale and to several other programs. Hillsdale was my first choice. I got in there. Dr. Ray ended up becoming my dissertation advisor, and over the course of my time at Hillsdale, I studied many courses in American political institutions, American political thought, the history of political philosophy. I wrote a dissertation on Niccolo Machiavelli. And then while I was finishing my dissertation, I landed a job at Texas State University as a lecturer in political science, and so spent 3 years there. During my time there, I ended up meeting my wife. We got married, and she came down to Texas, moved there about 9 months before I got the job here at New College. And so she spent about 9 months in Texas, and then we moved here.
Psych. Moved down to Texas just before you moved.
Yes, moving from hot to hotter.
Yes. It's a great story because it's somewhat, the experience that all college students go through as they're choosing colleges, and then in college is like, what am I going to do with my life? And yours seems much more deliberative than mine.
Well, leaving out some of the other parts of the Badger education, but yes.
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about your experiences at Hillsdale.
Yeah, Hillsdale College, wonderful place to study in that the focus is on primary sources. And so every doctoral student in their program, they have a Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship in which you study political philosophy and American politics. And so every student there has to take courses on Plato, Aristotle, early modern political philosophy, late modern, as well as a series of courses in American political thought and institutions, courses on the American founding, the Federalist Papers, 19th century American political thought, the development of American political institutions in the 20th century, and so on. And so Hillsdale was the most formative of my educational experiences, and it taught me how to study texts, great works, in a systematic and logically rigorous way. And Hillsdale is a wonderful community of scholars. My colleagues there, my friends, they're we're all very serious, both as upstanding Christian citizens and also as academics and scholars. And so my time at Hillsdale is really what ultimately brought me here, because I realized that small liberal arts colleges are the institutions in which you can convey the history and the philosophy of the West to future generations.
Okay, so let's address the elephant in the room here, in the Pompey room today. When Governor DeSantis decided to reform New College, he famously said that this place could be the Hillsdale of the South. So you're obviously the person most competent to comment on that idea. Tell us about your response to that idea, and,
Yes.
and speak freely.
Yes, well, that piqued my interest very much. I get to go to Hillsdale again. That sounds great. Yeah, I was not very familiar with New College of Florida until Governor DeSantis referenced that phrase, Hillsdale of the South. And that immediately drew my attention. Many liberal arts colleges today fail to understand what liberal education ultimately is. When we think of that word liberal, it comes from the Latin word liber. It means free. Right? Liberal education is meant to be an education of those things befitting of a free man or woman. Hillsdale understands this in a very serious way, and there's several other colleges that do, but reforming liberal arts colleges and bringing them back to that original understanding of what liberal education is, I think is one of the most important civilizing missions that intelligent and learned men and women can embark upon. And so that ultimately did bring me to New College, or put it on my radar, and made me realize this is the place to be. And the things that we've seen here, bringing in more great works into the core curriculum, introducing new fields of study that have often disappeared from the traditional curriculum. This is, I think, a wonderful and incredible experience.
So you recently published a chapter in a volume. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I believe it is hot off the press last week. The volume, the book, is called Winning the Crowd, The Politics of Popular Film. It is published through Rowman and Littlefield. All of the chapters in the book look at recent popular films through the lens of political philosophy. Some of these chapters deal with the recent Daniel Craig James Bond movies. One chapter deals with Gladiator, another with Master and Commander. My chapter dealt with Pleasantville, which is a movie from the 90s, stars a young Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon. They are teenage siblings going through the malaise of teenagers in the 1990s. And Tobey Maguire's character, he is a kind of lonely, depressed young man who escapes from reality by watching old 1950s black and white sitcoms. His favorite is a fictional show called Pleasantville, which is something like a Leave It to Beaver style sitcom where nothing really happens. The drama of the show revolves around Bud, a young man who wins the science fair and goes to prom with his date. Unserious things like that. And so these two siblings from the 90s are magically transferred into this program. And the young Tobey Maguire's character, he wants to maintain this sort of logical character sequence of the show. He wants to be just a nice, upstanding young teenage boy. But his sister is very bored with that lifestyle. And so she begins to fool around, so to speak. And as she does so, the black and white in the show begins to disappear and color begins to emerge in certain places. And this show is ultimately, I argue, this movie is a paean to the New Left, to this political and philosophical movement that emerges in America and reaches its peak in the 1960s. And here I'm talking about critical theorists such as Herbert Marcuse, sexual revolutionaries such as Wilhelm Reich, early feminist figures such as Betty Friedan, social theorists and activists such as Paul Goodman. These thinkers attempted to transform American political and social life by creating a new American identity. And this film shows you how that comes about. It is really an exercise in cultural revolution, in the way in which you take an existing regime and transform its symbols, its language, its ideas of justice and injustice. And so, over the course of this movie, the young teenage protagonists introduce not just sexual liberation, but also art and literature into this stultifying suburban community. And in doing so, they slowly transform it from black and white into vibrant colors. Now, there is a backlash over the course of the film that those characters in the town, the head of the Chamber of Commerce and other figures who are still in black and white attempt to prevent this revolution from taking place. And in doing so, they illustrate the way in which the New Left understood its opponents. And here you can think of works such as the authoritarian personality, right? The New Left's idea is that, well, if you oppose social and cultural change, if you oppose the sexual revolution, there must be something wrong with you, right? You must be sexually repressed, or you must be hiding aggression through a thin veneer of civility, or you must be a busybody of some sort, right? The New Left psychoanalyzed its enemies. And in doing so, this film tries to delegitimize opposition to the sexual revolution, opposition to the sort of cultural changes that you see in America from the 1960s onward. And now the film is well worth watching. It is a brilliant and careful understanding of how cultural mores can be transformed through the concerted effort of artists, of poets, of philosophers, and of literary figures.
But honestly, it's from the way you describe it, it sounds little different from Maoist agitprop. I mean, complete with color cues in case you didn't get the message, and clear division of the world into progressives and reactionaries. Is there no subtlety at all, or is that actually what the movie itself constitutes?
There is some subtlety, and much the way that the New Left was responding to a serious malaise that Americans felt in the 1950s, right? You think of the man in the gray flannel jacket, right, who lives this sort of boring suburban life, and he comes home at the end of the day from his boring 9-to-5 job and eats a TV dinner with his wife, and then goes to bed after drinking a martini, right? Not a great way to live. Now, the New Left understood that human life is supposed to be something greater than that. They did attempt to reach back into the existential questions of human life. What is the good? How should we live? What is it that makes us great? What is our real nature? Now, their solutions to those problems, their answers to those, I think, are crazy. But they did recognize, as this film recognizes, that human life has to be something more than mere economic striving. It has to be something more than going home at the end of the day and eating a TV dinner. And so the film, I think, illustrates that perennial problem of human existence.
But doesn't really do it in a subtle way, at least as you're describing it. I mean, we're supposed to know which side we sympathize with and which side we're not supposed to sympathize with.
That's right. It might not be subtle, but it is very clever. Gary Ross, the director, who's most famous for The Hunger Games, he was previously a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. And his political themes come across very clearly throughout the film, although what I noticed is that scholars and film critics who have written about the film never quite understood what is going on with it. They all recognized that the film was in some way revolutionary, but they could not put their finger on the pulse of what made it revolutionary. And that's because no one had really analyzed this film yet through the lens of the New Left movement. And so that was my contribution to the literature, so to speak. And what I recognized, how I conclude this article, I say that in a way the movie is a color revolution, right? It's a color revolution in the literal sense, in that you move from black and white into color. But the line I use, I say that it whitewashes its own revolution, because the film does not portray the more radical and unseemly elements of the New Left as a social and political movement, the things that Americans, even to this day, ultimately reject. You do not see the kind of political revolutionary violence that you had in the 1960s, this student movement, the Weather Underground, the bombings on college campuses. You do not see the more unseemly elements of the sexual revolution. Everything is presented as sunshine and roses. And in doing so, the film can catch you off guard, right? It, in a way, introduces you to sweet images that makes you unable to resist at a psychological level the rest of what the New Left has to offer.
In effect, it portrays a new kind of pleasant town without noticing it.
Exactly, yes. In fact, it's a sort of movement from a Pleasantville to a Pleasureville.
Pleasureville, I love it.
And all this is intentional on the part of the director and the writer of the film.
Very much so.
Okay.
It's an illustration of how this cultural revolution takes place. And in doing so, that is not a innovation. And I opened the article by talking about Niccolo Machiavelli and Plato, both of whom recognized that if you're going to shape a people, you must alter their symbols, their images, and the language that they speak. Right? Plato, in his analogy of the cave in the 7th book of the Republic, talks about these beings that are shackled to a wall, and all they see are images on a cave that are cast by fire and by puppets behind them. Right? And they mistake those images for reality. And Socrates, in the course of explaining this image, says that those people who are chained to the wall, are like us. What he means is that every political community has symbols and images that it uses to justify itself and to explain its purposes. The New Left understood this very clearly, and they used that knowledge to quite the effect when it came to altering American mores and ultimately altering our understanding of our own identity.
So, color revolution is a term that we hear frequently today in the news. So tell us what a color revolution is, and then is it intentional that there's a color revolution and then the film is literally a color revolution? Or is those terms not related?
That's right, and the way that I use the color revolution is not quite the way that we typically hear in the news, right? When you see the term color revolution, what that typically means is a political revolution that is going on in some far-flung corner of the world through an orchestrated effort of social and political activists, right? And that involves the overturning of governments and so on. You don't quite see that in Pleasantville. There are no laws that are changed. There's no governments that are overturned. But what you see is the cultural transformation that often takes place underneath color revolutions or political revolutions.
I remember when we were touring Berkeley, because my son was considering it, and we allowed him to consider it. We were on the campus tour, and we got to the president's building, and the student tour guide was expostulating about the glories of the 1960s at Berkeley, and she said, "Now this is where the free speech movement was launched. Now, can anyone tell me what the free speech movement was?" So I put up my hand. I said the free speech movement was a violent and censorious movement in which a small group of students prohibited other students from having free speech, and in the process trampled upon police and law enforcement rights. Long silence. Everyone in the tour turns around.
Yes, Bruce, you are attacking the gods of the city.
Yes, well,
this is what they killed Socrates for.
This is the symbol. This is the symbol. Like the symbolism is important. Like if the free speech movement has the positive valence normally associated with it, then it leads culture and society in a certain direction.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And what was the free speech movement? Ultimately, it was an attempt to open and shift the overtone window to the left. And you can see this in Herbert Marcuse's essay on repressive tolerance, right? We must tolerate movements and regimes from the left, but not those from the right, in order to shift society closer to the left-wing ideal. That's what the free speech movement ultimately was. And
now reclassified as hate speech, but it's the same debate, right?
Yes.
We all agree that hate speech should be banned. Just happens that everything we consider hate speech is basically conservative talking points, and therefore the window keeps shifting to the left.
Yes, that's right. And people often forget today how violent and controversial the student movements were in the 1960s. There's a great book called Days of Rage, which outlines the underground left-wing terrorist movements that operated in the United States from the 1960s to the 1980s. At their peak, there was something like 4 bombings a day that took place on American soil. And while most of these bombings did not include casualties, some of them did. And they were horrific. But that gets whitewashed in our popular understanding of the history.
Wow. And or what we're seeing today, is it similar echoes of with Tesla bombings and these kind of things?
Yeah, you don't quite, even today, have the violence that you saw in the early 70s in America. But we might be getting closer to that. And in some ways, you have a similar political divide, right? Just as Nixon in the 1960s represented what he called the silent majority, right? Which included the blue-collar, white working class. It included traditionally conservative communities, juxtaposed with these youthful revolutionary movements. Today you might have something similar, right? In that you have a populist conservative figure in the form of Donald Trump set against a more revolutionary, in some ways, different revolutionary movement that is not really anchored in any sort of traditional American politics or traditional American way of life, but in fact seeks to transform those things.
Maybe the better analogy would have been the Hamas movement on campus rather than the Tesla bombing.
Oh, no, I think it's all related. Tesla
Okay.
bombings,
Okay.
Hamas movement, the fire bombings of pregnancy crisis centers after Roe versus Wade was overturned, and at least in Canada, a little bit here, but the burning down of churches over the supposed moral panic of Indian residential schools, which our late Interior Secretary tried to import into the U.S. by commissioning a report on the horrors of Indian residential schools here. I haven't seen as many church burnings here, but to me, church burnings, Tesla burnings, Hamas attacks, pregnancy crisis center burnings, this is all part of the continuation of the revolutionary movement of the 60s.
Yes, absolutely. And it's worth bringing Hamas into this because in the 1960s, what was this movement? What were the fellow travelers there? Well, you have revolutionary student groups in the United States. You have this intellectual vanguard in the form of largely German thinkers who come over, such as Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, and they make alliance with third worldist movements, anti-colonialist movements across the world. Eldridge Cleaver, who was a leader in the Black Panther Party, writes this essay called The White Race and Its Heroes, in which he explains the alliance between the third worldist movements and the New Left. Cleaver, and this is going to sound very similar to what we see today, Cleaver says that the old pantheon of American heroes has been discredited. They were all racists, they were all evil, they were all slavers, and they attempted to create a society based upon white supremacy and oppression. And so Cleaver says we must create a new pantheon of heroes who we can celebrate. And he includes Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and other third worldist revolutionary leaders. And so you still see something of this alliance today between third worldist movements from the Middle East making alliance with campus radicals in America.
So you've done work in the classic canon of political philosophy. You've worked on Machiavelli, Thucydides, Leo Strauss. So that's covering a lot of territory, up to and including the American founders. I guess the question I wonder is, and this is my pet kind of interest, is to what extent are the American founders revolutionary in terms of this great break with the European tradition and the British tradition, which is, I think, the sort of apple pie version of American history, versus to what extent are the American founders deeply embedded in the classical and the Anglo political tradition?
That's a great and difficult question because the answer is both. In some sense, revolutionary, and in another sense, preserving and sustaining a much older tradition and understanding of what politics is about. The sense that the founders were revolutionaries, and that they understood that they were creating a new people on the American continent, right? They separate from Great Britain. As they say in the Declaration of Independence, we're going to dissolve the political bands which connected one people to another, right? So recognizing this is going to be a new people. It's going to have a distinct way of life. It's going to have a distinctly Republican character, meaning the people are going to govern themselves in their town assemblies, in their state governments, and also through the national government through representation. But at the same time, the founding is connected to the great thinkers in the natural law and natural right tradition. That stretches all the way back to the ancient world. Thomas Jefferson, near the end of his life, writes a letter in which he explains the intellectual sources of the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson says that, look, when I sat down and wrote the Declaration with these 4 other men on the committee, I was not doing anything revolutionary. I was not doing anything innovative. I was simply expressing the American mind as it was understood in the day. And Jefferson says you can understand the American mind through the pamphlet debates that you see in the 1760s and 70s, as well as through what he called the elementary books of public right. And there he lists Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon Sidney, and John Locke. And so there, Aristotle and Cicero, you have 2 great classical political philosophers. And in Algernon Sidney and in John Locke, you have 2 great political philosophers from the English tradition, all of whom recognized that justice is something that human beings can come to understand through reason. It is something embedded in the natural world, and that it imposes certain limits on what human nature can do. And so in that sense, the American founding is deeply conservative, yet at the same time, they are founding a much larger republic than you see anywhere in earlier history. They are creating a new representative form of government. As Alexander Hamilton says in Federalist 9, we have had improvements to the science of politics. Now, sometimes people misread the Federalist Papers and they say, oh, didn't Hamilton and Madison and John Jay invent a new science of politics? But that is a phrase they never used. They simply said that there are improvements to the science of politics. And so we can draw back to the ancient political science of Aristotle, Plato, Xenophon, Cicero, Livy, Sallust, Tacitus. But we can also recognize new contributions that have come about through John Locke, through the Baron de Montesquieu, as well as through the English political experience. And so, yes, it's a difficult question.
That's the academic answer.
Yes, it is.
It's always a bit of both.
So, Casey, is there a favorite class that you have, or what's some of the classes you enjoy teaching?
Yeah, I teach a wide range of classes in American politics and political theory. I teach our intro, American Government and Civics. I also teach American political development, Congress. In political theory, I teach courses really throughout the canon: classical and medieval political thought, early modern political thought, late modern political thought. I also teach a course on war and politics, which is really war and political philosophy. It's hard to say which is my favorite, right? In a way, they're all your children, and do you really want to choose which of your children is your favorite? And maybe you have one, but you don't want to say out loud. I only have one child, so I can say that currently. My favorite, I'll give you two. Once again, I'm going to be academic here. I love to teach the Federalist Papers, and I love that what the Federalist Papers does is it shows you what the real practice of politics is. It requires careful, prudential considerations of both institutions and of social practices. Another thing, though, and this is probably my favorite, I love to teach classical political thought. And my favorite thing to teach in classical political thought is The Clouds by Aristophanes. This is the play that got Socrates killed. It's a comedy and it is hysterical, and Aristophanes shows Socrates to be not only this bumbling, foolish figure, but also this dangerous, atheistic, subversive figure. And what Aristophanes does over the course of this play, I like to say that Aristophanes is an untraditional defender of tradition, in that Aristophanes shows us why we need laws and customs and traditions, and why our ancestors may have something to teach us. But he does not do this through the traditional means. He does not write tragedies as Aeschylus would. Rather, he does this through comedy. And he does this through comedy in order to show that tradition can't actually stand under its own weight. Sometimes tradition falls apart. And once it's fallen apart, it no longer has that pull on us. It no longer has that influence that it previously did. And so Aristophanes shows that we have to go back to the foundations. We have to understand the rationale behind our laws and customs and traditions. And that if we are to be intelligent defenders of Western civilization and the American way of life, that means that we must understand the reasons for these things and not simply accept them as traditions handed down to us.
A lot of incoming students at New College, as in most universities, will be dead set on their major, which we call an area of concentration here. They'll be dead set on microbiology or computer science or economics or the pleasures of Cambodian dance, and they're listening to you and they're thinking, well, this is interesting if you're going to specialize in political theory, but really not for me. They'll all get some exposure to this, but what's the case for them wanting to learn the sorts of things about the founding and the American political tradition that you teach?
Yes, well, this goes back to the nature of liberal education. If liberal education is that education which is befitting of free men and women, that must include understanding what a free political regime is and how you can sustain that freedom. And so all students, regardless of their area of concentration, they're all ultimately citizens. That is something that binds them together. And so in my courses, even if they are not in the political science AOC, they will learn how to think seriously and rigorously about political phenomena, and therefore better able to understand both their own politics and the politics of their fellow citizens. That is ultimately the draw that I get from many students, and I love to teach the American Government and Civics course because you get students from every realm of the college, from all sorts of different areas of concentration. They all bring something from their major into the contributions that they give in class, and they all, I think, come to understand that what they learn through their political science courses can teach them how to think seriously about every element of human affairs.
One perk of New College is that not only are we a honors liberal arts college, but we also happen to be in a beautiful part of the country where most of the year it is really nice outside. And I will often see Professor Wheatland sitting at a table outside under the palm trees with students, and they're just deeply engrossed and totally engaged in the conversation about, which I now know is political science and color revolutions and the founding of our country. And this is an advantage that we have here at New College, is that you can sit around with students and just have these great conversations.
It sure is, and you should study good and beautiful things in a beautiful place like this. Over the January term, I taught a group ISP on Plato's Republic, and I had 3 students. They were all wonderful, and 3 very different walks of life, very different interests. One was more interested in political science, another more interested in literature and creative writing, another interested in medicine and healthcare. And we sat and read Plato's Republic cover to cover and talked about it for 4 days a week, 3 hours at a time. And every now and then I would make them come down to the bay shore here, and we would read Plato on the bay, as if we were Socrates descending to the Piraeus, to the Bay of Athens, and having these philosophical conversations with young men who are seriously engaged in the political and poetic life. And so yes, if you're going to study these great, high, weighty, noble things, you should study them in beautiful buildings. You should study them in beautiful settings, because that ennobles and enlivens your soul.
That might be the new name for our podcast, Plato on the Bay. Is
Yes.
that better than Mighty Banyans, maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, well, now you're introducing a cultural revolution, Bruce.
Yes,
We're on dangerous grounds.
Well, that's my things. Well, Dr. Casey Wheatland, it has been great having you with us on the Mighty Banyans on the Bay podcast. Students, please reach out to Dr. Wheatland if you have questions about his courses or anything at New College. And next week, we'll be back with another exciting faculty guest. So until next week,
Go Mighty Banyans.